computing dimension right there. All right, cool. So here we go. You guys ready? You guys excited? You guys want to talk about GraphQL?
Yeah.
Me too. GraphQL is a lot of fun. I want this to be big. And I'm going to pretend that that'll do it. There we go. We're live. All right. So I just want to take a moment and talk about the company that I work for before I go too much into this talk. So the reason why I'm able to learn awesome technologies and work with really cool clients is because I work at a great company that I like a lot. So CleverTech, it's international. We're remote developers. You can work from wherever you want, including your living room, bedroom, coffee shop, whatever. And as long as you are passionate about what you do and you're willing to commit value to a project independently, you know, great fit. We have lots of opportunity. Everything from blockchain to C++ to JavaScript, full stack, React. There's even opportunities for business administrative assistants and that kind of stuff. So check it out. The original talk that I submitted here is the same content. I just changed the title. It was originally called Intro to GraphQL, Postgraph. It's all the same stuff, but now we've got a snappier title, right? Everybody wants to ship fast and avoid tech debt. So that's basically the same thing. And I'm going to talk about that too. So here we go. Well, what I'm going to show you was basically a risk that I took at the beginning of my project. I was like, I need to make this application secure. I've got 3 files that all do forgot password. Only one of them works, and the one that works uses like a really easy to guess token. Like it's not cryptographically secure at all. So that's just one of the 500 things inside of this project that needs to change. Oh, and now I'm alone. All 8 of my other developers are gone, and I'm the last one on the project. I have to rewrite it from scratch in order to meet this need for security all by myself. How can I possibly do that? I need something that's going to give me the ability to iterate at the speed of 3 developers or 4 developers and not really hurt me later when I have to go back and like change something because I took advantage of some like what you see is what you get magic. And yeah, I'm gonna say that I was pretty successful in this quest. And hopefully you guys will agree with me in a little bit. I want to talk about GraphQL in the context of REST. Who here knows what REST and GraphQL is? Most, no worries. Who here does not know what a REST API is? It's easier to like, you know, ask, and then when people don't want to raise their hands, they don't have to. So most of you guys kind of know what a REST API is. Let's just talk about it really quick. I built a lot of them. The idea of a REST API is you have an endpoint that returns a structure of data, and that's the data that that endpoint returns for that input. You could have an endpoint for all of the different resources, and if you want to load a page that shows your user, your book, all of the comments on it, you make 3 different requests. Or you could build an endpoint for every single page that packages all of the different data that you need for that page and just build 5,000 endpoints. And then when you want to go from version 1 to version 2 of your API, maintain 5,000 endpoints times 2. So that's REST. I never want to build another REST API in my life. They are extremely common. And GraphQL solves a lot of those problems. Let's talk about them one by one. So in REST, you have many, many endpoints. In GraphQL, you have one, just /GraphQL. And well, how does that work, right? You, rather than say API/books/book ID, you say GraphQL, and then you submit a post request with a blob of what looks like JSON without any commas. And if you think about it like JSON, it kind of makes sense. You have a object with properties inside of that object. Those properties are loosely typed, right? You could make them a function, you could make them a string, you could make them a number. In GraphQL, they are strictly typed. So all of those functions, all of those fields at the root of your object have a strict type definition associated with them. So if you were to call a query field, it would be an object. And inside of that query field, you could call the current profile property, which would be a function that would resolve to a set of properties, which are all typed and documented. That brings me to my next point. In REST, you have to write your documentation for all of your endpoints. You make a new endpoint, hopefully you update the documentation, you make a change, hopefully you update the documentation. In GraphQL, you describe your fields. So when you're creating the GraphQL API, you say, my field name is cat. My field type is a string. It just has a name. I don't know. Cats are a string. Why not? And my field description is the name of my pet cat. You load it up in GraphQL, which is an interactive documentation explorer. You see cat, description, all of that stuff. Really cool. And anytime you add new fields, they all come with their own descriptions. So you no longer have to worry about the API endpoint for the mobile app that returns all of the data for the orders view, because you have each of the individual elements queryable and described in a self-documenting API, which is kind of cool. I regret to inform you that in Windows, I do not have the code to the live code. I will show you individual code, like actual code, but I won't show you code running. Highly recommend you check out the thing that I will show you later in this talk if you want to see code running. Moving forward. If you have ever worked with Angular, raise your hand. Okay, if you have ever worked with React, raise your hand. Okay, jQuery and Ajax. Yeah, most of us, right? All of these things no longer have to be there in a large extent. Well, so React is awesome. Redux and sagas and reducers and managing state yourself across your application doesn't have to be there. Doesn't have to be there because we have something called Relay Modern. And I say Relay Modern, it's now just called Relay because when I started it was Relay Classic, which is like different. So Relay Modern is awesome. If I say declarative data dependencies, does that mean anything to anybody in the room? Yeah, a little bit. So one of the cool things about React, right, is that you can put your CSS, your JavaScript, your HTML all in one little spot. Some people hate that about React, but it makes it really easy to find things, right? If you have a problem with a component, everything's in one spot. Relay Modern lets you declare your data dependencies and get networking and caching for free as well. So you say, this is my JSON blob that represents a fragment of data that I want on this type. And I will show you this in code. It'll hopefully make more sense. But basically, if I want in my status bar, my current profile, my status bar says, I am wrapped in a query fragment, and my query fragment is on type profile. So any objects that return, any fields, any properties that return a profile type, I can request this data, this fragment on that type. So I have a profile object that is returned from a current profile query. And I say, okay, current profile query, in response, give me the data for the fragment for my status bar. Call it status bar data. Pass it down into my component, my status bar data, masks it out of the relay store, and we'll get more into this, it'll be fun. And what happens is you just get the profile object along with all of the other data dependencies across all of your other components in a single network query on page load. And you still only had to write one. So that means that if you need more data or you want to get rid of a field, you just scroll to the bottom, you delete it, that line from your JSON blob, and it's gone. You're no longer asking for it. You can always add more too. Just one line change in your file, network query updates, your store updates, all across your app. We'll play with that as best we can. Deprecation, this is an added benefit. I haven't taken advantage of it too much myself. But if you have an older GraphQL API like Facebook does, then you might have lots of different mobile apps that request different data and all of this stuff. And you can indicate in your API that this version of this field is deprecated and maybe you want to look at this other thing instead, while still allowing that data to be present using one API to service multiple versions of your client. So you no longer need V1, V2, V3. You have one API at one endpoint for multiple clients, which is kind of cool. Only had to do a REST API with multiple versions once, and the insanity is of having two versions of your API, and you have to keep them both like bug fixed. Like, well, that's gone. There's lots of ways to like quickly build a REST API, but have you ever used like magic REST API like CRUD creators? What's one that comes to mind off the top of my head? I don't know. Laravel has some cool CRUD creators built in. Laravel is a great PHP framework, by the way, just quick off topic. If you wanted to extend that API though, even with the magic CRUD stuff, you're still going to have to write your own controllers and functions and all of that stuff, and have a copy of the logic in your database as well, right? You have to have your data stored somewhere. In GraphQL enables a new dimension of API tooling because we have a schema. So one of the things you're doing when you're building a GraphQL API is you're creating basically a giant text document, not really by hand. You're using libraries to do it for you, but it's like a text document that speaks in a formal language about the schema of your API. Your top level object, all of your objects inside of it, all of their types, rigorously defined inside of this file. From that, you can create a mock server for testing. You can statically generate all of the queries that you need on your client side and store them in your database and reference them by ID. You can do lots of things, and one of the things that you can do is accurately introspect a Postgres database, pull out all of the types and all of the relations between all of the tables and all of the stored procedures, the row-level security, the role-based access control, and get an API. Get an API that just using SQL inside of your database queries and returns all of the data you want behind a JWT-based authentication layer. You could take it further with nonces and that kind of stuff. I did that on my production project. But out of the box, that's awesome functionality to have. Postgraphile is why I was able to meet that goal of having just me, right, on this team and up against this monumental task, and I have to show my client progress. So what do? Well, we write the database and then we start building the API. 5 or 6 migrations in, I have full CRUD for the basic features of the site, and I'm building the login page. Now I can focus on the cleanliness of my app and learn more about Relay Modern. So before we get to Relay, I want to ask, does anybody feel bad about keeping all of your logic in a database? Is anybody worried that your API is entirely based on an SQL Postgres database? How do you do other things like, I don't know, can anybody think of something a database doesn't do very well?
Well, it's exclusively Postgres.
So Postgraphile is exclusively Postgres. Postgraphile is built on a core tool called GraphQL, which is more ambiguous.
Yeah, I was wondering when there was like what's for MySQL.
So that's a good question. And I would actually say that there are certain things that no database does good, like sending an email or making a network request. So to really be able to accomplish those things, we take advantage of Node.js extensions. So I said that we have a schema, right? Postgraphile will build the schema from your database. During the process of building it, you can extend the schema builder to replace certain fields or types with other things, to extend certain objects to have other properties, custom resolvers. So you could make a root level field with a resolver that does a external network request or sends an email or checks your request and sets response headers. And you can do that in Node.js and still have auto-documenting GraphQL API and still take advantage of all of the other CRUD and row-level security built into the database. That really made this possible, right? Otherwise, I'd have to have like a REST API augmenting my GraphQL API to have that kind of functionality. So that's a cool feature in version 4 of Postgraphile, the new one that just went to beta. Yeah, I think I talked about most of the stuff on this slide. You can use Postgraphile as like a library. You can include it in your Express app and use it as middleware. That's how I do it. I'll show you. You can also use it as a command line application. Just point it at your database and walk away. Give it a list of plugins and let it run. Both of them have their advantages. One thing, though, that I want to talk about are migrations. So if you're putting all of your logic in stored procedures and you want to like update a stored procedure or you want to like change a table, you're going to have a lot of migrations. So one of the ways that I have solved this problem, at least to make it manageable, is to prefix my functions in their migration, right? If you can imagine, you have normally a migration called like, I don't know, add a stored procedure to, or add a user table, right, .sql. I'll have table underscore users, function underscore authenticate, function underscore sign up. So by looking at my migrations, I can see them. Okay, cool, that works good for the first one. But if you need to change it, right, you can't just go back to a migration file and edit it in place. It's not how migrations work. It's already been deployed. The database isn't going to run it again. So you rework it. Squitch rework is awesome. When you have a set of migrations, you deploy them and you tag it. Version 2.0.55 deployed. Okay, cool. Now I want to change a table. Well, that table hasn't been touched in like the last 20 versions. But when I go and I say squitch rework table name, it will generate table underscore, in this case, table underscore books at 2.0.55. This is the current state of the table. We're going to save it. We're going to inject it into our migration plan file. And we're going to say now, table underscore books, you're free to change it because it'll be at the bottom of your plan file and it'll run again. So what I'll do is I'll take, if I want to add a column, for example, I will take the entire create table structure, including all of the comments from the original file, copy it into a block comment at the top of the migration, adjust it as if, you know, it had the field from the beginning, so I can just look at it and see the current state of the table, make my alter down below, and it works. It gets me through. It allows me to make changes. It allows me to find all of the functions in the SQL file, see what things look like. It's a pain in the butt to a little bit of an extent, but I don't know if it's worse than having to keep my model, my controller, and my front end. By the way, we haven't even talked about Relay Modern yet, which really kind of sold it for me. But the pain of having to deal with migrations and stored procedures and the procedure language for PostgreSQL, PL, PGSQL, if anybody's ever worked with it, it's weird. All of that is totally outweighed by the benefits of a quick and easy GraphQL API that follows Relay Modern standards and that you can use like row-level security to really harden things at the database level. Because before this project, no project I ever worked on ever had row level security, like inside of the database. It was all like API level authentication. It's a really powerful tool. And when you're getting a security audit, which this application has now survived, that is one of the things that they will check for. Do you use row level security and role-based access control in your database? The production version of this tool, this is like an old version that I ported to open source. I'll get to it more later. Sorry, I haven't even talked about the tool yet. I'm getting ahead of myself. Moving forward, let's talk about Relay Modern for a second. So there's a few weird things about Relay Modern, but I just want to talk about them quickly before I show you code, where it'll start to make more sense. And if anybody could give me like maybe a 20-minute in heads up, just so I can really start speeding things up. I don't want to only have half an hour. So Relay Modern gives us the environment, which is where we store our data. It gives us a network layer, which is like, how do I fetch requests? You just write a callback function for like using whatever network API thing you want. You give it an endpoint, you give it maybe a set of headers, and then it will use that callback function to make all of your GraphQL requests. So it's like maybe 10 lines of code and you have your networking layer. The query renderer executes your root query, which is like your top level field that you inject your views, your primary display components query fragment into. From there, it'll get all of its descendant data dependencies very nicely, and we'll talk more about that. The query fragment container is how you wrap not top-level queries. So like query renderer is for your root query. Create fragment container is for your query fragments that go on your individual components. Commit mutation, that's how you make changes to the API. Anything that touches or modifies the database is a mutation. Updating a login time on login, creating an account, creating, editing, deleting mutations. Selecting, asking for, those are all queries. Kind of weird terminology if you're not used to it, but it makes sense once it's kind of talked about. So there's a lot of lift to get all of these tools together, talking to each other, getting your data layer set up, making your route query. Like, how do you get React Router into the mix, right? How do you have different route queries for different routes in your single page application? How do you tie that into an authentication layer? This has evolved a lot in my project before the security audit. So when I say like this technology has survived a security audit, it is a mature version of this platform. I can't really go into details too much, but it is currently being used to solve very sensitive business needs for international clients. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. It works. It works. You can download it. The setup process for this specific boilerplate that I created is not easy. You have to like copy different files and it's error prone. Please open GitHub tickets. I'll help you. Happy to help you. But yeah, if anybody wants to close GitHub tickets too, pull requests are welcome. Let's talk about it though a little bit. So there's a whole bunch of things that I want to go into. And I don't know how much time I have left. Let's grab my phone, take a look. Oh my goodness. So I did start late. Well, I guess I won't have a lot of time to go into all of this stuff. But I do want to leave time for questions. So if I stop in about 6 to 8 minutes, that'll give me time to at least open up the code. So let's keep going here. And that should give us time for questions too at the very end. Can I get out of full screen mode though? That's the question. Good enough. So this is Internet Explorer. No, I do not want that. Definitely not good enough. Let's see, GitHub. We want RPG boilerplate. GitHub.com's Chad Herman RPG boilerplate. So this is an open source project. It doesn't really have a license. I guess it's MIT license. Is that good enough? The migrations, right, they're tucked away in this DB folder. So we have deploy, revert, and verify. Deploy, revert makes sense. Verify, I'm not going to go into because it's weird, and I don't know it as well as I should. So the DB deploy stuff you can see, here's my prefixed migrations. Right? I've got schema underscore table underscore. I have table role-based access control and row-level security, for example. So this makes it so that this table can't be accessed because I've turned it on. Don't want to go into RLS too much right now. If you're curious, look up RLS and RBAC, role-based access control, Postgres. But this is basically what my migration structure looks like. Function underscore, table underscore, etc. Helps keep things clean. I don't have any reworked migrations in here, but again, just keep a comment at the top of your most current migration with the current state of the database object, and you'll be happier for it. So moving on, my API, right? Pretty simple thing here, pretty powerful. This is my API. I'm not even kidding. It's a single file that's not even just 21 lines, including some comments. This line right here, where is it? App.use, Postgraphile, PG connection string, schemas, and options. That does it all. Talks to my database, pulls out all of the data it needs, and generates. Let's see if I have a copy of it. A schema file. Is it here? No, there isn't one in the GitHub. And I can't run it for you guys. But the schema file, it's kind of pretty. So if you pull this down and run it and get help setting it up and all that stuff for me, feel free to ask again. Then you will see that schema file. It's really not that fancy. It's just like computer terms for types and stuff. Whatever. But that's the API. Let's talk about that one more time because it's worth noting, right? I have index.js. I import Postgraphile. I use it with some config options, and I have a full-blown GraphQL base, API based off of all of those migrations you saw previously. Yeah. So I wish I could open up GraphQL, but Linux was not being nice to me this morning. I'm just happy I can share my screen. Front end, here we go. This is where a lot of the crazy stuff is, right? This is Relay Modern. So if you haven't really been paying attention, if you heard GraphQL and Postgres and you're like, okay, cool, I get it, give me 5 minutes of your attention here. So the heart of this lives inside of app.js. And in app.js, right, we have the render function that takes in a query renderer. And it basically says, okay, give me my current profile. That's how I do authentication. Basically, I say if I have a current profile, then I'm logged in. And if I don't, I'm not logged in. So from there, we go up, trickle through some of this like routing stuff, basically. And is it a public route, a private route, or a regular route? And I'll show you that right now. But this is how routing works in the application. This ties everything together. So inside of the front-end shared folder, there's a routes folder. And I have a different route corresponding to different views. Every view has a route, every route has a view. Let's take a look at what a route looks like for a second. Here's my home route. So here I say, okay, I've got a path and I have a root query. So in this case, it is a query. It is a root level GraphQL object. It is called home query. Okay, I am only asking for the current profile property of the root query field. And inside of that, I only want the data necessary for the home current profile property. That comes from the home component, which I'm going to import. So this is declarative data dependency step 1, root query, right? Root query, query fragment. Query fragment is prefixed by the file name, and then it has the property. Okay, so let's go take a look at a view for a second. Shared views. So we have, home view, home.js. So at the bottom, here we have a fragment, right? Here I say my fragment is called file name underscore property name. Home underscore, and in this case, I want my property to be called current profile. any GraphQL field that returns a profile object, I can request this fragment on. This fragment just happens to include display name, which I use to just log out to the page. It's just kind of like an intro to query fragments. There's also mutations. So if we go to relay mutations, we have basic GraphQL mutations. They're relatively straightforward. They have a variables property, which has input for the mutation. And then they have the mutation itself at the top. The rest of it's basically boilerplate. Some of it's a crappy authentication logic that works but could be improved, and has been improved, but not in this version, unfortunately. The basic structure of a mutation, though, is here. This will talk to Postgraphile for us, and it will request on the mutation, the root mutation field, it will request to authenticate, right? That's the function name in my database, and it will pass in the input. And out of that authenticate, I get a JWT. Just to understand that a little bit better, let's take a look at the deployments. And I've got maybe another minute or two before I'm going to open it up to questions here. DB deploy function authenticate. So here we have some you guys can't see that. There we go. It's a little bit better. Here we have some Postgres PLPG SQL stuff. But at the end, we just return this type, which is our type for a JWT. We can put whatever claims we want inside of it, access it across the application. And because it returns it, and it's a stored procedure, and it's not stable, right? If you read more about stored procedures in Postgres SQL, stable means it doesn't change things, it's just asking for data. This is a volatile query. It does change things. That's why it's a mutation, not a query. It's a volatile stored procedure, changes things. That's why it's a mutation. That's why we use commit mutation to call it. API.commit mutation. Takes in the mutation you want, the variables, your success handler. And that'll do GraphQL stuff for you. So I guess the only thing that we're really missing is GraphQL, but it's just an interactive documentation explorer. You have a column on the right with your documentation, your types. You click the types, you can see them all. Build your JSON blob-ish query in the left-hand column and push go, and it works. Okay, cool. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to get through. I think if we were to go back to the slides really quick, there's a whole bunch of stuff. I can just talk about it really quick. We talked about routes and views and query fragments and mutations and rework. We talked about the profile table, JWTs, a little bit about plugins. Didn't go into it very much. It's kind of an in-depth talk. I could do an entire talk in Postgraphile plugins themselves. But you can basically Node.js schema extensions is all you need to know. API calls, emails, stuff you can't do from a database. Things to consider if you're going to use this: row-level security. The policy executes, at least in Postgres 9.6, on every row of the table. So if you have like an RLS policy that's like joining like 2 million row tables together to like evaluate if like the user can like enter this room or like see these messages, that's gonna go slow. So you have to be really careful about that. You probably want to denormalize data. Just be aware that if you make really complicated RLS policies, when your databases grow and your project succeeds because you shipped it on time and you have less technical debt, right? That's just something that you have to be keeping in mind. You're doing it all in your database too, so your database servers have to be a little bit more powerful than maybe they've been in the past. You know, I recommend Amazon RDS. It's really cool. This works in RDS. It's great. And it has lots of replication and load balancing tools as well. This is now in beta. It was in alpha. Stay up to date on the updates to any like non-stable projects. The author is amazing at keeping it up to date and telling us where the breaking changes are and all of that stuff. So just follow it. and if you want to be on the bleeding edge, right? They don't call it the bleeding edge for nothing. Other things I didn't talk about, file uploads. In GraphQL, file uploads are a little bit weird. There's some different documentation on it, but basically you would be probably having a third, like a side channel to get the file up, and then returning and storing like a link to the file. And then so your GraphQL would give you a link in the database rather than letting you like download files directly. Download and upload. We didn't talk about pagination or refetch. Relay has components for both of those things. My boilerplate is not currently using Create React App. It did a long time ago, and then I like ejected, and I like modified it a bit to work with Relay Modern. There's a branch to bring it back, but it doesn't have server-side rendering, just so you know. The open source RPG boilerplate doesn't have nonces. It doesn't have JWT caching. These are all things that you probably want in production, right? You want the ability to manually expire a JWT to avoid cross-site request forgery, that kind of stuff. And the SSR server could be better. Right now, it's really good for like route-based authentication, but there's, I think, still a query, a hash mismatch. So the front end then refetches everything anyways, and it could be improved, but it's there. And everything's hooked up with Docker. So you just like Docker compose after going through the other setup instructions, and you have something that you can play with. I'm done. The question is open up to you guys for, yes, anyone with anything. Yes, sir.
So how crucial is it that you use a framework? Can you just is it can I just use GraphQL and I guess on the back end and have my own and then just grab the incoming code and use like jQuery on the You
can. If you really want to. If you want to like build your own like GraphQL query with like string concatenation or whatever, like you absolutely can do that. There's lots of other tools. It doesn't have to be Relay Modern. You could use Apollo. That's by a company, and I have it on my previous slide. Just a quick shout out to Apollo. They have similar tools. It doesn't build your API for you. It provides you a set of tools for building it more manually. And then they also have back-end and front-end tools. They have a hosted solution, much more mature than Postgraphile, but I still love the power that I get from, my database becomes my API, and I can extend it as needed. Apollo's cool. You can use GraphQL in whatever pieces you want. You don't need a framework. Good question. Anybody else? Looking around the room, people are afraid. They're shy.
So what is graph.cool versus Apollo?
Just another service. I think there's even a third one, like Prisma or something like that. But it's just another way of building GraphQL APIs. Yep. Good question. So who's going to run home and play with GraphQL now? That's optimism. I'm happy to see at least somebody raise their hand. Yeah, I'm definitely open to answering any questions you guys have. I am available in a couple of different channels. And thank you so much for being here. And I hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you.